What most recently inspired the sermon was a book I read called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. Brown is an artist, a poet, a doula, a healer, and a social change thinker. Emergent Strategies is this book that she writes about how we might step into a world filled with change, work with change, how we might do all of that without perpetuating patterns of hierarchy or dominance and submission, but instead in ways that might foster creativity and cooperative responses to what faces us. Which, as the climate strike this week made loud and clear, may be exactly what the world is going to require of us all right now. What was super surprising about Brown and her book is that the author traces one of her fundamental influences to that of another author. The author who most deeply influences Brown, you might be interested, is not a social scientist, not a political scientist, not a psychologist or justice ethicist or even a theologian, but a science fiction writer. Brown traces her sense of how the future should be shaped to a science fiction writer, to the future writing of Octavia Butler. Butler, a California native, died in 2006 at the age of 56, and among her accomplishments was that she was the first science fiction writer to receive the MacArthur Genius Award. The book that's most quoted and referenced in Brown's writing is Butler's Parable of the Sower, which is why I made that book our minister's book club book for this month. The discussions are coming up Wednesday night, Thursday at noon, so if you've read it or if you're a fast reader, come join. I don't yet have the answer to how a science fiction writer shaped the social change theories of a young activist, healer, and artist, but I love the invitation to reflect on it. Butler's world, the one in Parable of the Sowers, is about a bit like the book that you described, Sam, in your reflection. It's a world in pieces, with racism and violence and poverty and economic ruin as the backdrop. Somewhere, though, I am told, Brown found in the story of this future a way through all of that that has taught her how to think about holding this world differently. And that's enough to keep me in it, hopefully finishing it by Wednesday night. Brown's homage to Butler's fiction is also another reminder to me of how a book has this power to imprint on us, pivot us, change us. A colleague and a friend of mine I was remembering said that she rereads To Kill a Mockingbird every year and has since she first read it in high school. I'm not sure what moves her to do it. I wonder, is it to see through the eyes of 6-year-old Scout, so courageous and so open-hearted, while she gets this front row seat to the world's cruelty and unfairness? Is my friend reminded of her own heart before it was broken by the world? Does that help her to step each year into her bold social justice work? Or does she read it to be in the presence annually of the courageous and principled Atticus Finch, who uses his power and his skills for good, or tries, against the odds of history and culture, of racism and ignorance? My friend, of course, is not alone in her love of this book or her regard for it. Did you know that British librarians in 2006 ranked To Kill a Mockingbird ahead of the Bible as one book every adult should read before they die? And I don't think the recent publication of Go Tell the Watchman, Harper Lee's first earlier draft of the novel with its much more complicated, less noble version of Finch, I don't think it's displaced for most of us the version that we first knew and the characters we fell in love with. Lucy Smith, a member here, said her first life-changing book, the one that comes to mind, was for her Wind in the Willows. I read it by myself, she said, in second grade, and it just opened worlds of imagination to me. It also awakened me to ways the written word could be used to build a world, not just to convey action, a place Dick and Jane never touched. And she said it provided my teacher the opportunity to introduce me to the dictionary. She threw me in the deep end with Oasis, and I've never looked back. Lucy, you should know, is now a copy editor and a true lover, addict of language. For myself, the most profound experience mediated through a book was an experience of grace that I had while reading St. Augustine's Confessions. Grace, just to define terms, is for me the experience, for me rare, of the breaking in of something that I would call God, though as Forrest Church said, God isn't God's name, but our name, some of us, for what's greater than all of us and present in each. And in that moment of grace, some sense of love and radically accepting presence and wisdom that is in that moment too. I actually don't think that grace is innate to the book, The Confessions. What I actually think is that the God of my understanding finds a way in when it wants to, and that was just the vessel for the moment. But because of that, it has to rank as one of the books that's changed me. Otherwise, top among the books that influenced me for some reason would be two that are maybe strange ones, but they changed me. And they wouldn't let me displace them for others this week, so here we go. One is a translation of the Tao Te Ching, Stephen Mitchell's translation in particular. The Tao, of course, is 81 chapters or sections of wisdom that are among the fundamental teachings of Taoism, writings credited to the 6th century BCE teacher Lao Tzu. I had read the text in college, but never Mitchell's translation. When I read Mitchell's translation, I was already in seminary, and so I was immersed in what I would call liberatory ideas about text and our relationship to it, including that texts should be gender inclusive. In my Bible class, we stayed away from versions of that text that assumed God was a he. We knew the God of our understanding, any God worth God's salt, would be beyond gender. And we knew how gendered language had made a he God a force of exclusion, a justification for the diminishment of women's leadership. We knew it, I knew it, in our heads. Mitchell's translation woke me up to what it really meant to know it. In his introduction to the translation of the text, Mitchell also addressed gender. As I recall, he said that the Tao also didn't have gendered language in its original. At least this is what I remember. but that English made neutrality hard to capture, so he would try to avoid gendered language. Or maybe he just made that choice for similar reasons to the ones that my professors were giving. Anyway, he said he would try and translate it neutrally throughout the text, or if he couldn't, he would alternate he and she so it was balanced, and that seemed fair. Knowing that, I read along passages about the Tao and the Master, and though they were probably gender neutral, I realize now that I read into them an implied he, an implied masculine identity. And so it was, I was caught completely by surprise in an early chapter that read, "The Master allows happiness to happen. The Master shapes events as they come. She steps out of the way and lets the Tao speak for itself." The Master, she? I thought. Have you ever had that experience where you think something before you think it? I mean, where you have some automatic pattern of thinking, and then only then does your mind, the more studied mind, kind of catch up with you? Well, my automatic thought was, what? The Master, she, and then only then did my studied mind leap in to say, yes, of course it can be a she, dummy. Why couldn't it be a she? But already, the effect had taken place. The fact that the Master could be a she had dropped deep inside me, beyond my head, into my whole being, down to my toes, anchoring me in that truth. And it changed me. A translation, a small choice of pronoun, and my whole sense of myself and my entire sex. We were all raised up to the level of master by a simple S added before an HE. Maybe related, it feels related. The other book that changed my life, I'm embarrassed to say, is the book Good to Great by Jim Collins. Collins is a business professor, and he was interested in what made some companies begin immediately and stay great, but then he went back later and he went to study companies that had been good performers, solid, maybe mediocre ones, but somehow had become great, sustainably great. He and his team of 20 researchers identified the companies that fit this category of good to great. And then they set about studying everything about them for the clues of this transformation. And Collins admits that early on he told all the researchers not to look at the leaders. He said leadership was overrated as a cause and a catalyst. And so his researchers came back to him with lots of facts, with lots of facets of the transformations that they saw in the companies they were profiling. But they also kept coming back wanting to name something about the quality, particular quality of leadership that seemed to make these transformations possible. And Collins eventually was convinced. But the leadership he saw wasn't at all what he expected. And what he found changed my sense of leadership. What great leadership could look like. The notion that Collins had in mind, and I did for years, and maybe some of you can identify with, is this idea that a leader who leads a group or an organization, any kind of group or organization to do great things, has to be charismatic, has to be bigger than life, has to be this force of nature, dramatic and irresistibly compelling. But that wasn't what they found in these organizations. Instead, they found a different kind of leader. I mean, one who was compelling, of course, right? Compelling enough to turn around the entire culture of a place, but one that gave credit away where it was due. Leaders who were loved by people and who people willingly partnered with. People whose names, though, most of us wouldn't know, not any of them. Leaders who didn't make the front page for their splashy acts and didn't want to make the front page. People who just cared deeply about the institution they served and had integrity and humility and put themselves behind mission, embedded in the work, but with this persistence, that was common, persistence to get the job done. And he said people who constantly talked about how lucky they were, how lucky they'd been, how lucky they were to work with the people they did, but who also took responsibility when things went wrong. Reading that chapter, I literally felt a yoke of expectation that was chafing me raw with guilt and some shame fall off my shoulders. Have you ever had an experience where you feel like a yoke has literally been lifted from your shoulders and you walk lighter? Up until that point, I actually went around thinking that if I loved the world, and I did, and wanted to champion the good and heal it, that I would have to figure out how to be a different human being. That I would have to find a way to get a personality transplant. Or fake being someone other than I was and hope that it stuck. And I had no idea about how I was going to do that, and I didn't want to do it either. But I would try, I thought, because I loved the world. Reading Collins, I realized that none of that was necessary for you or for me. That as Collins and his researchers pointed out, those who turn the world around are often just good, hard-working, humble people. Yes, people with insights. Yes, people with skill and some vision of where they're headed. People who are smart and persistent. You might even say stubborn. But people who feel they're lucky, too. Because they know they couldn't do it alone. That none of us could, that none of anything that's enduring is never done alone. And like it, none of the responsibility rests on any one person. And if it rests on people, it's definitely not waiting for some booming-voiced, circus-like leadership figure. To take the ordinary, the broken, even just the painfully mediocre places in the world and have a chance to help remake them just takes the best of who we already are. And that was a changing moment for me, found in a book that was probably published by Harvard Business Review. I discovered long ago that when I moved, I only felt like I was home when two things happened. When I got my paintings and framed photos of loved ones either up on the wall or sitting on mantles, and when my books came out. These books, they're like my friends, and they're anchors, and they're talismans too, protecting me somehow. Reminders of what I know to be true, where I feel like I'm drawn. Maybe they are keys also to secret gardens that I long ago discovered and need to be able to return to time and time again for renewal. I imagine you all have books on your shelves that are like friends, or that you carry in your hearts. I bet you would put them on a table with flowers representing the beauty of everybody in your life who together makes it extraordinary. Pieces of what formed you, formed all of us, that lie very neatly between the covers of a book. So blessings to our sacred libraries, whatever is in them, and blessings and gratitude to those who wrote them. Amen.